evening, everybody. Luke Groman, founder and president, Forest for the Trees. Hope everybody had a great weekend. We've been very busy. We've been out at baseball. Did some swimming today with one of my sons and was out helping another one of my sons over at a friend's horse farm moving some hay bales. We definitely got some exercise in this weekend. Hope you had a great weekend too. Let's jump right into the two things that grabbed my attention recently. Before we start, just wanted to point out, in case you haven't seen it, we have a virtual event. We do this quarterly, limited number of seats. It's next Monday, the 22nd of July, 4 p.m. Eastern or 4 p.m. New York time. Like I said, limited number of seats, and if you sign up, you get a slide deck we've put together. We run through the slide deck, take Q&A on it. It's basically 2 hours, just a nice conversation where we can kind of really have the chance to flesh out a number of different issues into some of the things we're talking about, some of the things that interest you guys. So check it out. It's on the link to register is in the heading of this Periscope. So if you're interested, check that out there. So with that out of the way, let's jump right in. A couple things that have grabbed my attention recently. The first was something I retweeted. Citi's Willem Buiter thinks that current monetary policy is, quote, the land of make-believe, which I thought was a potentially important signpost. And the reason I say that is I remember back in 2003, 2004, or even maybe as early as 2002, out here in, call it, sort of flyover country, we were seeing loans being made that made no sense. We were seeing, people making $25,000 a year getting $300,000 loans to buy houses, and we couldn't figure out how it was getting done, and we thought there was certainly no way that it made sense. And the zeitgeist of the era was, hey, stay in your lane. We know what we're doing when we make these loans. And of course, about 3 or 4 years later, it turned out they didn't know what they were doing. And it was when Wall Street and then sort of, senior level people on Wall Street started going, uh-oh, this doesn't make sense, was really a very big sense on timing. And so I spin this forward to today. When you see someone with the stature of a Willem Buiter, who's a distinguished career, saying we're monetary policy is now in the land of make-believe, 10 years after we entered the land of make-believe, to me, that's an important sign on timing. And so that's why I thought that was an important signpost in terms of if we're in the land of make-believe, if even, sort of the senior guys are saying we're in the land of make-believe, I think there's important implications for that. Second thing that I thought was important was there's an article last week in the FT noting that economists share blame for China's, quote, monstrous turn. Western intellectuals must now seek to contain Beijing. The gist of the article was effectively that Western economic policymakers had created a Frankenstein, and the monster was now, killing the village, so to speak, to go along with the old story. I just thought it was really interesting. Many of the academic economists being referred to here as having created a monster vis-a-vis China are now firmly against Judy Shelton's policies vis-a-vis gold, with her being nominated to the Fed board. And it's fascinating because for us to actually slay the monster, if you will, for these policymakers to fix what they've done wrong vis-a-vis China, you need to implement Judy Shelton's policies. You need a neutral settlement asset like gold. Otherwise, if we just leave the system as is, the United States, there was an article I've retweeted and mentioned a number of times in the FT earlier this year called Diagnosing Your Own Dutch Disease. And it notes that basically the U.S. has dollar Dutch disease. We are the Saudi Arabia of dollars. And as long as we're the Saudi Arabia of dollars, we will see productive industry offshored. We will be in charge of producing and recycling dollars on some level. And the Chinese will use the mismatch between the value of those dollars and the real value of underlying commodities and continue to go all around the world buying up real assets on the cheap, whether that is gold, whether that's oil fields, whether that's copper fields, whether that's Greek ports, whether that's real estate, whatever it is. They've been playing a game of here, you take the dollars, we'll take the real assets, the more finite real assets, for going on 10 years, and certainly aggressively in the last 7 years. So ironically, FT saying, okay, well, Western intellectuals created a monster. These same Western intellectuals are now poo-pooing and dismissing the woman who has the idea that is absolutely the solution to the problem. So that strikes me as interesting and important on a number of levels. So jumping into questions here. I had two questions on my updated thoughts on the trade or currency deal. Is Trump delaying this thing? Great questions. It, to me, I thought something seemed like perhaps it happened at the G20. You saw, that there was positive, if nothing else, spin that a conversation or a de-escalation had happened. You did see a number of steps the U.S. took that seemed to be either good faith, steps in the de-escalation, or the U.S. being forced to back down, depending on how you want to spin that. Whether that was some comments Trump made about Turkey, Trump's comment made about Huawei, etc. And so, the bottom line answer is I don't know. It seems like they are still talking. A currency is still key. But it's kind of gone radio silent, and so it's a very good reminder to me in terms of, hey, we need to keep tabs on this, and so I appreciate you guys bringing that up in terms of an update, and that's something we'll be watching for closely. Second question, thoughts on Deutsche Bank saying that the Fed may need to have standing repo program in place by early 2020. Look, I think this is another part of the Fed is going to have to inject dollar liquidity into the system, whether it likes it or not, whether the market's at all-time highs and whether unemployment's at 60-year lows or not. Fed funds over IOER, or interest on excess reserves, requires the injection of dollar liquidity. Step one is cut the IOER rate. Step two is institute some sort of repo program, which is effectively just injecting dollar liquidity. Step three would be rate cuts. Step four would be QE. And so I think we're likely going to continue to see down this path. Ultimately, the reason that this is being discussed is because there's U.S. deficits are too big and foreigners aren't buying enough of them anymore. Speaking of Fed funds over IOER, I had a question on mechanics of Fed funds over IOER. The bottom line to it is foreigners are not buying enough treasuries. The domestic private sector, therefore, is being forced to. And so if, say, FFTT's, bank account, corporate bank account, I can keep it in the bank and earn basically zero, or I can put it in a money market fund, a government money market fund, which buys treasuries, and I can make 2% plus. And the answer is we put FFT's money in the FFTT's money in the government money market fund. So 2% pickup with basically the same risk. Multiply this all over the U.S. economy, and what you find is that Americans are lending their money to the government instead of keeping it in the banking system where it can count as reserves. And then you get, as reserves get more scarce, you get Fed funds above IOER, and that's effectively what's going on. It means that what many think are excess reserves are not excess. It means that there's the tightness of dollar liquidity in the U.S. banking system, and the Fed's going to be forced to address it. And we think that's what's going on with the cuts to IOER, and eventually what we're going to see here with rate cuts, in theory, beginning this month. Any comments on the recent 30-year auction? Last week, for those of you who missed it, worst 30-year auction in terms of bid to cover in 5 years. Certainly, there was some timing stuff, and as always, it seems like these days with some of the geopolitical tensions between the U.S. and China. Comments on the dollar by Powell, not on the dollar, excuse me, but in terms of just the dovishness from Powell that may have been read through to the dollar. The bottom line to me is that it's very odd that you have a weak 30-year auction, that week a 30-year auction at a time when everybody is clamoring for duration. I mean, Austria had no problem selling their 100-year bonds. And so it strikes me as odd, and I think it's strike you as odd as well, because it's a big non sequitur to the narrative that people can't get enough treasuries. And so it's something to watch going forward. Very clearly, the trend in bid to cover for U.S. Treasuries of all durations has been down and to the right over the past 5 or 6 years. So it's not like this is a one-off. This is a continuation of a trend. And then the last question here, China and its allies seem to be moving toward a decoupling from the dollar, establishing parallel settlement mechanisms. New sanctions on China's purchases of Iranian oil could accelerate the move and significantly destabilize matters. Would this alter your bearish dollar position? Great question. The short version of it is that from a purely mechanical standpoint, if the U.S. were to sanction Iran further or China and attempt to stop China from being able to buy Iranian oil, ostensibly in their own currency in yuan, that would, all else equal, mechanically be dollar positive, just on the mechanics of the liquidity flows. but then also probably from a risk-off standpoint in terms of markets, purely mechanically. The flip side is there seems to be a surprising degree of comfort among purely economic market participants in the U.S. in particular that the Chinese are actually going to play by the rules of sanctions, which is to me a little ironic because many of these same people often complain about how little China follows the rules on the trade stuff. But for some reason, they think they're going to follow all of the rules on any type of sanctions. And even if they did follow the rules, you got to start thinking I find that many purely economic market participants are not evaluating things enough through a realpolitik lens. And by that, I mean, if you think China is going to allow its people to starve for lack of oil, I think that's probably a bad assumption. And so, to me, the part of the question about these parallel mechanisms being set up, I think they're much closer to being ready to go. And if the U.S. pushes too far, they may not like the result. The U.S. may not like the result because China can say hey, we have partnered with Russia and Iran, and we now value we are now buying oil physically and settling it in gold at a rate of 500 barrels of oil per ounce of gold. And now either gold has got to go to the moon or shale has got to get put out of business, depending on how you want to adjust that 500 to ratio. But that is, I think, an in extremis scenario. But again, once you get the realpolitik, if you're making the assumption that China's going to allow themselves to starve for lack of oil, I think that's a bad assumption. And so to me, I'm always trying to look at these things in terms of, okay, what would I do if it really came down to it? Are there systems there in place that would allow them to do that? And increasingly, it does look like those systems are there in case they need them. So that's it for tonight. I'm going to get jumping again. Check out again in the heading if you're interested. The next week our quarterly live event, limited number of seats, 4 p.m. New York time on July 22nd. And as always, thank you for tuning in. And we will be doing this again. I think 2 weeks from now we may be out of pocket, so we may not do it then, but we will certainly be back soon. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll chat soon. Take care, everybody.